Chess is a game that's played on a board of 64 squares, but sometimes one square in particular is more important than all of the rest. And in the game you're about to see, that square is the c5 square. And there is a battle over this square that happens in this game, and the player who wins that battle ultimately wins the game. This is a positional masterpiece. You're going to enjoy it, but you're going to learn a lot about how positional and strategic decisions can ultimately lead to victories in chess. Let's jump right in. This is game 20, by the way, in the Logical Chess series. Rubinstein is playing as white, one of the greatest players who never became a world champion. d4, d5, we have a queen's gambit and a queen's gambit declined. Black is preparing, if white captures, to recapture with a pawn and keep that solid pawn on d5 in the center. White plays knight to c3, and black decides to play the move c5. Now, this is a very aggressive approach, and you're pausing your development to immediately strike back at the center, because sometimes black never gets a chance to play this move c5, and so they immediately decide to play it early. Okay, now one of the drawbacks of this is that white can capture, and when you take back, you now are at risk, when these pawns get traded, of having an isolated pawn. An isolated pawn in chess is a pawn that has no pawns on the adjacent files. Okay, so for example, if I wanted to, I could trade here and immediately give this isolated pawn to black, and you can see how that's actually a weakness, right? And it's very easy for me to capture that. Now, black would not recapture my pawn right away. They would probably throw this forward, then take this later, and it's going to get a little bit tricky. This is why white didn't do this, because they didn't want to allow this pawn to push forward. But at the end of the day, this is constantly a possibility, and the d5 pawn is going to be a weak isolated pawn. So this is kind of one of the drawbacks to this move c5, which is called the Tarrasch defense, by the way. Okay, and it's funny because in the book he mentions Philidor, who talks about the isolated d pawns. He says this: a pawn, when separated from his fellows, will seldom or never make a fortune. He's basically saying isolated pawns are bad and you should avoid them. So that's what he's talking about. Tarrasch, on the other hand, says this: he who fears possession of an isolated d pawn should give up chess. Okay, he's saying if you don't like playing chess with an isolated d pawn, you shouldn't even play. So there's two camps, right? And they're both right. Okay, there are advantages to the way that black is playing. He's playing quickly. He's getting the files and the diagonals open right away so that his pieces can be involved right away. And yes, it comes at a cost that you're going to have an isolated pawn, but that's okay. White, on the other hand, is saying, no, I'm happy that I have an isolated pawn. So you can see both sides of the coin, and let's see what actually happens as the game goes on. Okay, so knight to f3, knight to f6, both players are developing, and white plays the move g3. Now, this is a very nice idea because if you think about it, whenever these pawns get traded at some point in the future, this is going to be, as we talked about, a target. So where is white positioning their bishop? Well, they're positioning it on a square that's going to be very easy for it to attack that weak pawn. Yes, you have to move the knight out of the way, but once you do that, you have a threat on that d5 pawn. Okay, so very smart decision by white. Black plays knight to c6, bishop to g2. Black decides to trade. White recaptures, and now we have the situation that we kind of were talking about. These pawns finally got traded, and here is the isolated d pawn. Now, what happens next is very interesting because black plays the move queen to b6, and if you would like to pause, what do you think white played? And I'm going to guess most of you maybe are not going to come up with this move. Well, the move that white played, which is the best move, I think, according to the engine as well, is knight takes c6. Now, the problem that you might notice with knight takes c6 right away is that it gives black the option to take back with the pawn, and guess what? This is no longer an isolated pawn. You now have a pawn supporting it, and now it makes your bishop look kind of silly because you're attacking a pawn that's very well defended. Why would white do that? Well, do you remember what the most important square on the board was in this game? It's the c5 square. White is basically saying, look, I didn't really have a clear path to win this pawn. I mean, yes, I can move my knight back and create the pressure there, but he's going to throw it forward. He's starting to attack me. This is kind of annoying. The bishop's coming in. This guy's coming out. The rook's probably going to come over. And even though it's an isolated pawn, it's not easy to figure out how to deal with this. You might say, well, can't I take here and try to win the pawn? No, because queen takes c6 hits the rook. And you can see how it's very dynamic position. It's not that simple, right? So what white does instead is say, okay, I'm going to take here, and I'm going to totally shift my focus from attacking the d5 pawn to controlling c5. Now, when you look at this position, the c5 square probably looks irrelevant. It looks like, who cares about the c5 square? Why does this matter? Well, watch what happens as the game goes on, okay? So let's keep going. White castles, you want to get your king to safety first before you embark on these other types of plans. Bishop to e7, and now white sets it in motion. Knight to a4, and pay attention to right here. Okay, it also comes with a tempo by attacking the black queen. So black plays queen to b5, and now I have a question for you guys. White is about to develop the bishop. They have three choices, 1, 2, and 3. Which one do you choose and why? Well, the choice is bishop to e3 because, remember, white is going for the control of the c5 square. Now, bishop g5, not a terrible move. Bishop f4, not a terrible move. These look like perfectly fine diagonals. But he makes an interesting note in the book. He says, when there is a clear plan in the position, you need to go for that. You need to focus on that as opposed to kind of random developing moves and just hope that they work out. Well, I'll just put my bishop here and see what happens. Well, I'll just put my bishop here and see what happens. No, go with the particular plan. Now, for a lot of people watching this video, it's probably still unclear why this is the best plan. But hang with me. You're going to see as we get towards the end, okay? So bishop e3 is the move. Black decides to castle, and white plays a very natural follow-up move, rook to c1. Notice, 1, 2, 3 moves in a row, white has played with the intention of gaining control of this c5 square. So if black was smart, rather than castling, they probably would have played something like bishop e6, adding more support here so that they could push this pawn quickly, like rook c8, and try to push it right away before white completes the blockade, which is what we're going to see in the game. Okay, so rook to c1. They play bishop to g4, which does come with a threat. Make sure you identify the threat first. Very good. There's the threat. And now the question for you guys watching, how do you deal with this threat? You have quite a few options. Which one do you think is the correct choice? Well, if you had a chance to look at that, there's, you could play knight to c3. The problem with knight to c3 is that you now lose your pawn on b2. Okay, so you don't really want to do that. You could play rook to c2 to defend. The problem is you block the queen and now you lose your knight. Okay, so that's a blunder. You could play rook to e1, but your rook is like, yeah, it's kind of just babysitting a pawn. It's not really ideal for a rook. And so what Rubinstein decides to play is the move f3. Now, we need to talk about this because I know that there are a lot of beginners watching that say, no, I'm not supposed to move pawns in front of my castled king. And normally you are correct. But in this case, notice that the bishop on e3 is doing a very good job of controlling that diagonal. See, the reason that you don't want to move pawns in front of your castled king is because you create weaknesses. But in this case, the weaknesses that are created are not a big deal. Black has no way to take advantage of that, right? This is still defended nicely by the h-pawn. This diagonal is still controlled by white. If white needed to, they could tuck the king over and get away from that. Their king is actually totally safe. So that's the first thing. The second thing, you're blocking the bishop. However, this was already well defended by black. That's not really what white's focus is. White's focus is, remember, the c5 square. So blocking the bishop temporarily is not a big deal. It also comes with a tempo on the bishop. This forces black to move their bishop back, which saves white some time, which is very nice when you're trying to get this blockade in before black has time to push it forward and cause you problems. Okay, so I hope that makes sense why f3 was actually a good move for white. So black retreats the bishop, and here white plays the move bishop to c5. Now, this is a very important move, okay? When you have a weak square on the board, which is the c5 square, and you don't want to allow your opponent to move the pawn forward, a lot of times the best strategy is to blockade it. Because if you imagine if black at some point brings a rook here, and they try to push it forward. Now they have support from the rook, right? The rook is now defending that pawn and adding support to that square. But if you blockade that, it doesn't matter. They can have both rooks lined up behind here, and the pawn just can't move, right? Pawns cannot move forward if there's a piece there. That's how pawns move. They can only capture diagonally or move if it's empty, right? So blockading the pawn is a great strategy, and that's what white does here, okay? Black plays rook e7, rook e8 to defend the bishop, and white plays the move rook to f2. Now, rook to f2 is a very nice move, okay? You might not realize it, but really, it's setting up in the future to double up rooks here, okay? This pawn is going to move forward at some point. This guy's going to swing over, create the battery, and really increase the pressure on black's position, okay? Black plays knight to d7, and white now trades and plays a very nice move here. If you would like to pause, what do you think the move is? Get a chance to look at that. The move is queen to d4. Now, it's important to note a couple things. Number one, the queen is defending the knight. You have to make sure you pay attention to that. But on d4, it's still defending the knight. And more importantly, on d4, you're controlling, wait for it, the c5 square, keeping the grip on that all-important c5 square, as well as adding just all sorts of control of the board. I mean, look at all the squares that the queen is now controlling because it's sitting on d4. Very, very powerful outpost for the queen, essentially. Okay, the queen to d4. Black plays rook to e8, trying to bring the rook around and maybe come over here. I mean, what else are they going to do? Notice how their position is very, very cramped because they were never able to move c5. All right, so let's keep going. And by the way, if you still haven't figured out why this square is so important, that's okay. I think this game is best understood by looking at the whole game and then thinking back after you see the entire game, like, oh yeah, that c5 square really was a critical component, okay? So don't stress about not understanding it just yet. Just keep watching, and you're going to see at the end how it all fits together, okay? Bishop to f1. So white is saying, look, my bishop's not really doing anything here. I'm going to relocate it, maybe gain a tempo on the queen, and get ready to push this pawn forward and double up the rooks, okay? And that's what we see. e3, very powerful move, comes with a tempo, and unleashes the rook to come over here like we talked about. Queen moves, and knight to c5. And again, white is blockading the pawn so that it doesn't matter if black has rooks or whatever behind to support it. You can't move it forward, okay? Continuing to dominate that c5 square. Takes. Black just plays rook here, and the other rook comes over, completing the battery and really increasing the pressure on the position. And it's about here where you can kind of start to see black has no real moves. Unless you're willing to just abandon this pawn, you kind of just have to keep dancing around and defending it. There's not really much that you can play, okay? Let's keep going. b4. Once you've blockaded it, now you bring in extra troops. And the threat is simply to go b5 and win a pawn. Like that's the plan, right? And of course, if you go b5, this guy can't move because you have the pin, and it's just a bad situation. So black says, let me try to stop that with a6. What do you guys think white played now? Well, the move is rook to a5. And basically he's saying, look, I've got this blockaded now. I'll just start shifting and attacking other things. And you can basically do whatever you want if you're white because you have more space, you have more control, and black is just tied up defending. And it all came back to, again, the c5 square. Let's keep going. Black plays rook to b8, trying to counterattack here, hoping for some sort of a trade, probably where they invade with their queen and maybe get some counterplay. White says, nope, I don't think so. Let me just play a3. I still have this threat. It's not going anywhere. I don't need to rush and panic. And black is really the one who has to figure out something to do. So black plays rook a7, trying to defend the pawn here. And now white has a little tactic to kind of break through the position. This is very common. When you're playing these strategic positional games, you squeeze and squeeze and squeeze and squeeze, and you're going to get to a moment just like this, where now you have to find a tactical kind of breakthrough, okay? So if you guys want to pause, what's the move here for white? You got a chance to look at that. The move is rook takes c6. And it's a very nice move because if the queen takes, I think black did take. Yeah, they did take. The rook now is undefended behind. Okay? And so you get the pawn, you end up trading the rooks, and you still have a very nice position. You're hitting this guy, you're hitting this, and continue to build the pressure. But nice little tactic there. Rook to a8 defends the rook and also saves the pawn. So white simply goes back to c5. And notice how they're keeping control of this file. They're not letting the queen invade and start to threaten things on the king and put themselves at risk, right? They just keep control of the file. Okay, and again, how many pieces have we seen move around the c5 square, right? A knight, a bishop, a rook, a queen. White is just using it like a landing point to like jump here and do this and do that. c5 square, massively important. Okay, let's keep going and finish out this game. Black plays queen b7. They don't really want to trade queens and go into this endgame. It's going to be a bad endgame where white has total control over the file and the extra pawns over here. They play queen b7. And white plays a calm king to f2. Very nice move, bringing the king closer to the center of the board. In case the queens do get traded, you will want your king to be there. And it's still pretty safe behind all of these pawns. h5, bishop to e2, just kind of solidifying the king's safety, making sure there's no checks or anything that could really cause problems to white's king. Black's just kind of making random moves because what are they going to do? Their pieces are tied up defending. You can't really move anything else, right? White plays queen to d6, adding another attacker to the a6 pawn. And at this point, black has to choose what they want to give up. If you try to go here to add a defender, you now give up the d5 pawn. And so black decides instead play queen c8, trying to invade along the c file. And white says, no, thank you. I don't even need to take that pawn right now. I'm going to make sure I don't have any problems with my king. I'm not going to allow the queen in. Okay, and when you're winning a game, this is a good strategy. Just eliminate any hint of counterplay from your opponent. Don't even let them have a chance, right? That's what's happening here. Queen to b7. h4, again, just kind of clamping down on the position. Why not? You've got the time. Black's getting desperate, so they try to play a5, trying to open up somehow, and white simply invades with the rook. And notice now, white has control of the c file. White has control of the 7th rank. White has control of the 6th rank. White has control of the c5 square. White has a totally safe king. White has a... And all of this happened because they controlled the c5 square. So the queen is actually almost trapped. Only move is queen b8. And white simply pushes the pawn. And basically, this guy is going to win the game for white. There's not really anything black can do. The game concludes with b6. Rook comes up, b7. Threat is to, at some point... well, actually, let's just pretend for a second. Black plays the move. Well, let's say they play king g7. How would you finish off the game here as white? Well, this one actually is a little tactic. Rook takes f7 check, unleashes the queen. Okay, let's say they play, let me find a different one here for you. Let's say they play the move queen to e8 instead. How would you finish off the game here? Well, the move is actually queen to b6, which traps the rook. It's probably the simplest and easiest thing. Notice the rook can't go anywhere, and you can't defend it with the queen, and so you just win the rook. And one more little exercise for you. Let's say black plays queen a7. How would you win the game here as white? If you had a chance to look at that, there's a couple of things you could do. Probably the easiest and simplest is queen to d8 check. King can come up, and you simply get another queen. Would be an easy way to do it. There are some other moves as well. But you can see the game is basically over because the b pawn is too strong and black's position is just a mess. And it all happened because of the c5 square. Hope you guys enjoyed this. I'll see you next time for game 21, which starts on page 134. Stay sharp, play smart, and take care.